morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session of the JTF series. Before beginning, I just wanted to thank you all for attending, and I especially want to thank our very own Christina Van Riper for herding all of the cats, ensuring everything comes together in a timely and professional manner, as she always does. Today is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Michael Sugich and Peter Sanders, or as I know them, Haroon and Abduladim. Today, they are the co-PLs behind Grant ID 61893, the Luminous Virtues of the Living Sages of Islam. So I'll introduce them both briefly. Michael Sugich is the author of Signs on the Horizons, Meetings with Men of Knowledge and Illumination, and Heart's Turn to Sinners, Seekers, and Saints on the Road to Sinners, Seekers, Saints on the Road to Redemption. He has been a professional writer for over 40 years, a native of Santa Barbara, California. He studied at UCLA and at the California Institute of the Arts. He was initiated into a traditional Sufi order in 1972. Since that time, he has studied Islam and Sufi doctrine with spiritual masters across the Arab and Islamic world. He lived for 22 years in the precincts of the sacred city of Mecca in Arabia, where he kept company with many men of knowledge and illumination, and he currently resides in Istanbul. Peter Sanders is the preeminent photographer of the Muslim world. He began his career in the mid-1960s as one of London's key photographers of rock and roll musicians. His pictures of Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, the Rolling Stones, and The Who, and many others many other such performers are classics of the genre. In the late 1960s, he went on an intensive spiritual search throughout India, which culminated when he embraced Islam and set off on a photographic journey of Muslim lands that has lasted for nearly 5 decades. He has captured over 500,000 images of the Muslim world, which have been exhibited in the US, UK, Australia, France, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, China, Morocco, and other countries. His 2 photographic essays, In the Shade of a Tree and The Art of Integration, are classics. In the course of his travels, Peter Sanders has undertaken a unique quest to photograph the living saints of Islam. In 2019, he published Meetings with Mountains, and Michael was also very closely involved with that, which was a monumental photographic essay of his 5-decade quest to capture the saints and sages of Islam on film. So in the interest of time, having heard their bios now, I'll jump right to describing the general thrust of their project, and they'll go on to describe some of what they've been doing in the project in the presentation. So one of the major contributing factors to the rise of extremism in the Muslim world has been the absence of authentic spiritual role models. In traditional societies, these were the saints and sages of Islam. They were the spiritual and psychological anchor of the society, the fulcrum of sanity, and a source of solace for people. In earlier ages, these men and women were fixtures of Muslim life. They were trusted, revered, loved, and sometimes feared for their truthfulness and penetrating insight. They gave hope to their communities and sometimes stern guidance. There was also something subtle, almost imperceptible, something rare and precious. It was the absence of ego. In its place, luminous knowledge, humility, generosity, selflessness, kindness, wisdom, and love. But where are these exemplars today? Are they extinct, or are they hiding in plain sight? And how did they attain these transcendent states of being? The Luminous Virtues of the Sages of Islam is a project that aims to restore awareness of these living spiritual exemplars within the Islamic tradition through the publication of 9 pictorial illustrated biographies of Muslim saints who have left a profound contemporary legacy of knowledge, humility, compassion, wisdom, and service. They are soon to be published as a collection entitled Exemplars for Our Time. In the following presentation, Michael and Peter will introduce the project, the subject of sainthood in Islam, and the methodology that leads the seeker to spiritual attainment. I've been told that at times Peter may chime in to give some more context to the pictures we'll see here in the presentation, and they'll both be available to help answer any questions that may come up in Q&A after it's all over. So I will go ahead and stop prattling, and I'll let the show get on the road. And so, Michael, please take it away. Inshallah, bismillah.
Thank you very much, Rashid. Thank you. You've actually said a few things that I'm going to repeat again in the course of this talk. So I'm going to begin by telling you how this project started and why. Back in 2015, Islamic State was sweeping across large swatches of the Muslim world, capturing territory, prisoners, and headlines with a stream of shocking atrocities perpetrated in the name of Islam. I'm sure most of us or all of us are aware of that horrible, horrible period. They were doing this across the Arab world, in Africa, in Turkey, in Europe, and in North America. What was really disturbing was that this malevolent, murderous cult was also capturing the imagination of young people throughout the Muslim world, and even more upsetting, young people from Europe and North America. Why was this happening? Well, this was the focus of conversation at a dinner I attended in Abu Dhabi with one of your foundation's representatives. I suggested that one contributing factor in the radicalization of Muslim youth was the absence of authentic role models. These were the saints and sages of Islam, and in the not so distant past, they were a recognizable feature of life in Muslim societies around the world. Over the last century, these luminous souls, who had always been the moral and spiritual gold standard for Muslims, seemed to have disappeared, along with the spiritual sciences that made them saints in the first place. And there are a number of reasons for this state of affairs, but the end result has been that the generality of Muslims has, to an alarming degree, become disenfranchised from the spiritual dimension of Islam, which is called ihsan, roughly and not very well translated as excellence. The Prophet Muhammad, in the famous tradition in which he is interrogated by the Archangel Gabriel in the presence of his companions, describes ihsan as to worship God as if you see him. For while you do not see him, surely he sees you. Ihsan then indicates an intimate, immediate, experiential sense of the presence of God. It isn't a concept. Ihsan is understood to be a station of knowledge, and those who attain the station of ihsan have reached the station of sainthood. I can't remember whether I said all of that, but that was the gist of it. But I went on to say something to the effect that if young Muslims are deprived of the spiritual dimension of life and the experiences that go with it, what we would call dhawq or taste, the tendency would be for them to gravitate in one of two directions, toward hedonism, materialism, and self-gratification on the one hand, and on the other hand, the adrenal rush of something extreme, something exciting, high-risk sports, dangerous adventure, protest, rebellion, revolution, combat, and at the darkest edge of the spectrum, crime and terrorism. Anyway, that was more or less my contribution to the discussion that evening. I went home and I more or less forgot about it. But a few days later, I received a message requesting that I submit a proposal for a John Templeton Foundation funded program on Muslim exemplars. And then I discovered that there was this whole field of exemplar studies I knew nothing about. So I set about writing a proposal on behalf of the organization I was advising at the time. In the event, for whatever reasons, the proposal was never submitted, but the whole exercise got me thinking. For the last half century, I've been a practicing Muslim and a follower of the Sufi path, which is the science and methodology that leads to the attainment of ihsan. I had the immense blessing and good fortune at the beginning of my journey to sit in the company of true Muslim saints, at first in Morocco, then later in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. My exposure to these luminous people completely transformed the way I saw things and the way I lived my life. I wrote a book called Signs on the Horizons, which was published in 2013. It was a memoir of my own experiences with these people over several decades. Originally, I wrote it for my children, to leave some kind of a record before my memory started to fail me altogether. I had no idea how the book would be received, but discovered that there was a much, much larger and more enthusiastic audience for the subject matter than I anticipated. Mostly educated young Muslims looking for guidance and struggling to find meaning through their religion in a very confusing and challenging world. The news that there were actually living saints now walking around was a revelation for many young people. My dear friend, the photographer Peter Sanders, had spent the same half-century photographing these people, Muslim sages, around the world. In 2019, he published Meetings with Mountains, a unique photographic essay. I have a copy of it here. I'm going to just pull it out for a second, if you can see it. It's a great book, very heavy. He published this extraordinary photographic essay of all the awliya and salihin, the saints and sages that he captured on film, many of whom had never allowed anyone to photograph them before. The first print run of Meetings with Mountains was priced at around $100, and it sold out within months, which is an indication of how much interest there is in this subject. Earlier the same year, another book I'd written was published. So Peter and I set out on a joint book tour of the United States, and one of our stops was Allentown, Pennsylvania, where we met Rashid Dar. And I related my previous experience with the Muslim exemplars proposal and wondered if this idea would still be of any interest. With Rashid's encouragement, we went through all the processes and were awarded a grant in 2020. And we're very grateful for that. The centerpiece of the project is a series of 9 illustrated books, 8 of which are biographies of contemporary Muslim sages. By and large, the authors were scholars selected on the basis of their direct relationship with the subjects they were writing about. The first volume introduces the reader to the world of sainthood in Islam, which sadly is a subject unfamiliar to most Muslims today. In earlier ages, the saints of Islam were the benchmark for what a human being could be. The village sage could have been a local imam, a jurist, a saintly woman, a shoemaker, tailor or tanner, or a wealthy merchant. In the cities, there were sages that were well known and sometimes celebrated, scholars, saints with many thousands of disciples, and there were those who were entirely hidden. Many had great formal knowledge, and others were completely illiterate, but illuminated from within. They populated the mosques and madrasas. They took to the roads, traveling from town to town and country to country. They were master craftsmen who led the guilds. They were manual laborers, farmers, traders, shopkeepers, and school teachers. They were grandmothers who taught the Holy Quran. The point is they were mixed with the people. They weren't in some kind of an ivory tower or a monastery. They lived among all the people, and they served them according to their capacity. So our aim with this project is to revive awareness of these people who still exist by telling the stories of their lives. There's a rich tradition of Muslim biography, the tabaqat literature, which inspired and educated Muslims from the earliest period of Islam. Yet this powerful teaching tradition has been all but lost to young people today. This is to a great extent because the notion of sainthood has not been sufficiently contemporized, and the spiritual sciences that produced these saintly men and women and that were intrinsic to the practice of Islam have been marginalized over the last century. Now, it's probably a good idea to stop at this point and clarify what we mean when we talk about saints. The concept of sainthood in Islam is distinct from, say, the Catholic understanding of sainthood. The identification of sainthood in Catholicism, as I understand it, involves a formal and juridical process of post-mortem canonization. whereas in Islam, the saint is deemed so while living, based on his or her inward spiritual knowledge and beatitude, which can be recognized and even measured by other saints and evidenced by the perfection of his or her character and behavior. And this is very important. Saints are described as the people who do what they know. Learning and knowledge are not academic for them. They put everything they know into action. In Islam, sainthood then is a reality directly
I hope
linked.
this brought a little bit more clarity to the.
Hello?
You're good now.
Sorry.
I just had to mute themselves. Sorry about that.
Okay. Am I being audible?
No, you're totally fine. There was just someone who was on
Okay.
mute. We're good now.
Okay. All right. In Islam, sainthood then is a reality directly linked to spiritual knowledge. The knowledge is called ma'arifa. Ma'arifa derives from the Arabic root ain ra fa, which means to know something by direct experience or to be personally acquainted with something or someone. The one who has this direct perceptual knowledge is called arif, or knower. So sainthood in Islam, or wilaya, is both explicitly and implicitly related to the direct spiritual knowledge of God, or ma'arifat Allah, which results in the effacement of the ego. This knowledge is achieved, or rather gifted, to the seeker in the context of purification, worship, and invocation. That is the repetition of divine names and supplications and remembrances of God, until the invocation and the awareness of the presence of God fills the heart and overcomes the ego. The aim of all authentic religious practice and belief is to transcend the lower self and the base material world and purify the heart through prayer, fasting, renunciation, and generosity, and emptying the heart of worldly and psychic distractions and forgetfulness of God, so that these are displaced by the light of the divine. This is universal across every religion, every confession, every spiritual path. This is where we all have unanimity. When the heart is overwhelmed with light, the soul is abased. And the person who experiences this is overcome with humility, awe, and love, not with pride, a sense of superiority, and enmity against others. Those who have genuinely effaced the ego and who are given an opening to divine knowledge become friends of God, about whom the Prophet Muhammad said, when they are seen, God is remembered. We have a vast and richly detailed literature on the subject of sainthood, which has been ignored and nearly forgotten in this time by the majority of Muslims. One of the marvels of this literature is that there is an astonishing unanimity among the people of attainment on the nature of sainthood and the sciences that lead to its goal. To get to the point I'm trying to make, I need to take you on a fleeting and I'm afraid overly simplistic metaphysical detour. So please bear with me. There are two supreme stations associated with Ma'arifa. The first is called Fana. Fana is the disappearance or dissolution of the lower self, and it is what aspirants on the spiritual path long for. One of the sages described Fana as leaving yourself behind, is ceasing to exist as an individual entity. Another declared that Fana is when the immensity and greatness of God appears, effacing the individual from everything, from his own mind and individual self. And then he goes on, and effacing him from this effacement, and effacing him from his effacement from effacement, as he is immersed in the divine immensity. Or another way of putting it is he is drowned in the ocean of unity. Now, this isn't poetry or fantasy. These are descriptions by people who have had these direct inward experiences. The second and more advanced station of knowledge is called baqa, which is generally translated as subsistence. This station of knowledge is described as a return to consciousness of existent things after having passed away from it, to consciousness of the sensory after having passed away from it, except that the individual then sees it as subsisting through God. The 20th century sage Muhammad ibn al-Habib, who is profiled in this series, referred to his own direct experience of effacement and subsistence in a poem from his famous diwan. He wrote, "I had an illusion, and when it departed, my heart looked out upon a light from eternity. Then it mounted upon its yearning and flew forth to be near to the one it loves until it arrived. It beheld the cosmos as a fading chimera, and the forms of existence were effaced and disappeared. Then it was returned to the state of subsistence and reaffirmed the cosmos from which it had withdrawn. In this station, it united all of the opposites and affirmed God's oneness inwardly and in deeds." Now, for most of us, these supreme spiritual experiences that define sainthood may seem incomprehensible, out of reach, and impossible to discern in a friend of God. This quandary was expressed by one of the saints who said, "It is more difficult to recognize the friend of God than it is to recognize God himself. After all, God is recognized by virtue of his perfection and beauty. By contrast, how long will it take you to come to know another creature like yourself who eats as you eat and drinks as you drink?" It would seem that this puts the seeker at a distinct disadvantage. How can an ordinary person who aspires to a spiritual path recognize a saint or an authentic spiritual guide? One statement on effacement and subsistence provides a clue, and here it is. The terms effacement and subsistence are also used to mean the process of emptying and beautifying. And the Arabic words for this are takhliya wa tahliya. And so they may say he was effaced of his reprehensible traits and sustained in his praiseworthy traits. This statement mirrors that of another sage who wrote that effacement refers to the disappearance of blameworthy qualities, while subsistence refers to the persistence of praiseworthy qualities. It is the disappearance of blameworthy qualities and persistence of praiseworthy qualities, what we call luminous virtues, that define a living saint in this world and may allow us to recognize one without necessarily understanding his or her inward attainments. The illuminated men and women who have reached the goal of ma'arifa are transformed. They personify the beautiful qualities of character we associate with saintliness and the best of humanity. They're selfless, kind, patient, forbearing, generous, forgiving, compassionate, humble, incredibly humble, and wise. And they are like this all the time. They don't have bad days and good days. They're always the same. Being around these people changes you. But there is no question that the sages profiled in this series were neither supernatural nor were they infallible. Our aim, in fact, is to present these beautiful human beings in all their humanity without romanticizing or mysticizing them. However, being human does not mean surrendering to immorality and evil. The suggestion that every exemplar must necessarily have an underside does not apply here. The whiskey priest or Tartufian lecher do not exist in the particular universe we're exploring. The exemplars we are profiling are men and women who have subdued their lower natures and extinguished their egos through purification and by the grace of God. Now, at this point, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to do it and give you a preview of the books and some of the people we're talking about. So let me see if I can pull everything up. All right, how do we do? Oh, yes, here we go. Right. My screen is shared, right? Okay.
I can't see your screen quite yet.
You can't see it now? Okay, share. I see what you mean. Hang on. Now, can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes, that looks great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Just give me a minute here. Sorry.
Just press play.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Give me a minute. Maybe Peter could say a couple of words while I'm loading this. It's. Yeah.
I think that the only thing I would say is that their faces say more than words can ever do, actually. And I think photographing them is some ways very challenging and not. Unlike most of us, they don't put on a special face to be photographed. They just are who they are in front of you. So that was always really interesting for me. And I always had a very short time with most of them because most of them were very elderly. I think the oldest person I photographed was 125. Many of them are centuries.
All right. Okay, I'm ready now. This gentleman lived to be 140, as I understand.
160. 160.
160. All right, there you go. The first volume in the series is a general orientation to sainthood in Islam, explaining who these remarkable people are and why they're so hard to find these days. Volume 1 describes the attributes, human and spiritual, of a saint in Islam, the nature of spiritual authority, and the ways of identifying a truly qualified spiritual guide in Islam, which is a burning issue among young people today who are looking for guidance. This volume also addresses the question of why women sages and saints seem so few and far between, whereas in reality, there are as many women saints in the world at any given time as there are men. The life stories of these remarkable people are told against the turbulent backdrop of the 20th century. These sages experienced colonialism, world war, revolution, imprisonment, exile, and they witnessed the desacralization of their societies and deterioration of traditional values. Each has left a lasting legacy of wisdom and teaching that continues to inspire generations of young people seeking a sane, balanced, tolerant, and compassionate way to live in a challenging world. And these are the saints. Both Peter and I have encountered most of them. This is, say, the Fatma al-Yashrutiya. This was my teacher, Sayyid Omar Abdallah, great educator. Muzaffar Ozak was a great sheikh in Turkey. So I'm going to complete this session with a reading of excerpts of two of the biographies, beginning with the biography of Sidi Muhammad ibn al-Habib. In the Moroccan city of Meknes along Boulevard El Haboul, which curves along the edge of the old Medina, a nondescript entryway gives out onto a long, inclined, weather-beaten, whitewashed passageway open to the sky. The passage leads up to a double door opening onto a stark, cavernous room covered in hasira mats and striped carpets. There was nothing ever physically or architecturally remarkable about the plain rendered brick structure or the utilitarian interior decor. Yet in 1971, crossing the threshold of this empty space was to walk into a parallel universe, an intensely radiant world concealed by the daily rigors of worship, learning, and service, and revealed in circles of invocation in remembrance of God carried out within its walls. The light that saturated this unprepossessing edifice emanated from a single centenarian saint and his illuminated followers. This was the Zawiya, the Sufi lodge of the teaching Sheikh Sidi Muhammad ibn al-Habib. In 1971, this venerable scholar saint presided over his Zawiya as he had since 1936, when it was first established as a place for learning and the practices leading to the purification of the heart and the knowledge of God. He was 65 years old. He was 65 years old when he opened his Zawiya, the age when most men retire. He had now reached his centenary. This would be his final year on earth. The Habibiyya Zawiya served as the home of the Sheikh and a center for instruction and discipline of aspirants on the spiritual path of Islam. Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Habib brought the full force of 19th century Sufism in all its rigor and purity into the 20th century, and then over a period of 60 years guided generations of sincere seekers to the knowledge of God. That year, a handful of Westerners joined the gathering. Most were new to Islam, all were novices. Few had ever laid eyes on a saint, or for that matter, had any idea what a saint was. Suddenly they were sitting in the presence of one of the greatest living saints of the age and surrounded by other men who had attained stations of sainthood under his guidance. Imam Shazali, the 13th century Sufi master, was once asked why he did not write books. He replied, "My companions are my books." The sheer number of illuminated souls gathered that spring who claimed Sheikh Ibn al-Habib as their guide, and their collective incandescence was testament to the majesty of this spiritual master. The power of the light from these men, its penetrating clarity, and the discipline and self-denial that produced it by the grace and mercy of God could be almost unbearable for the self-absorbed novice accustomed to the endless distractions and self-gratifications of the modern world. Here was a pre-modern world where the ego was the enemy and God was the friend. And according to the wisdom of the path, the only way the enemy could be defeated was to be occupied by remembrance and love of the friend. With relentless, single-minded intensity, the sincere disciples of Ibn al-Habib turned away from the ego and by remembering God at all times, aspired to lose themselves in the love of God. In the words of God enunciated by his messenger, "My servant never ceases drawing near to me by supererogatory works until I love him. And when I love him, I become the hearing by which he hears, the sight by which he sees, the hand by which he grasps, and the foot by which he walks. Were he to ask of me, I would surely give to him. And were he to seek refuge with me, I would surely give him refuge." Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hanson, the president of Zaytuna College, who I believe is known to some of you, has written a biography of his teacher and spiritual guide, Sheikh Murad Bint al-Hajj, and I'm going to read a passage from his book. Murabbit al-Hajj would appear to many in modern society to be a primitive, a simple Bedouin living in a tent. Yet his spiritual, emotional, and intellectual development should compel us to question our assumptions and see the shortcomings of our own civilization when compared to the desert culture that produced him. For this simple man was a grammarian, logician, rhetorician, theologian, jurist, judge, leader of a clan, father, husband, traveler, mystic, and a profound and pious human being. He may seem an anachronism in an age racing towards transhumanism and metaverses, though not metaphysics. In today's technology-driven societies in which computers mediate everything, our reality and our relationships, our financial transactions and our consumer choices, our memory and our history, and even our pursuit of knowledge and wisdom, we would do well to remind ourselves of that which can be achieved without modern technology. Murabbit al-Hajj lived an unmediated life, governed by the sacred monotony of diurnal existence, telling time with shadows on the ground or celestial clockworks in the night sky. He learned, preserved, and transmitted ancient knowledge to others and contemplated the meaning of being a fully realized human being in complete submission to his creator. Murabbit al-Hajj was a simple and sagacious man of immense wisdom, an anomalously learned nomad, content and grateful for the gift of life, who used his time on earth to occupy himself with what concerned him and to share the gift of his vast knowledge to edify those around him. He had penetrated the mysteries of the world and its temporality, and he set his sights on a far greater, far more interesting arena of our inner world. May God sanctify his soul. So there you have it. Bismillah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael and Peter.
Yeah. I hope that was okay.
I for one, definitely enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else did too.
Yeah.
We have at least one question on the docket right now, and I'll read it out to you. So it's one, well, it's actually two questions in one from the same individual. So the question is, the effacement of the ego is a characteristic of holiness in Christianity. Would saints in Islam be considered holy men? Would saints in Islam be considered holy men and women to Muslims? Some Christian saints, I think particularly of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, wrote about steps or stages in the ongoing process of a deeper union with God. Have Muslim saints described similar experiences?
So the question is, would they be considered holy? Yes, definitely. I mean, as I said before, all of the traditions that we follow have the same pattern, because they're all from God, and so the stages would definitely be the same or similar. It's just that most people are not interested in attaining these states, so they've been sort of forgotten. But there are different methodologies. You know, in each age, the methodologies change, and with the times, because, like, for example, now it's recognized that most people are so distracted. I mean, we have so much distraction that, you know, a couple of centuries ago, people didn't have the enormous distractions we have today that keep us from being able to attain these levels of spirituality and sainthood. I don't know if I'm not sure that that's answering the question that's been posed. The short answer is yes, they are considered to be holy men. And is there something beyond that, though?
Marianne, if you had anything else you wanted to add, please let us know. But I think that's sufficient for now. We have another
Yeah.
we have another question that's come in, which is, are Muslim luminaries venerated in any way like Christian saints after their death?
Yeah, definitely. Among the Sufis, one of the practices, because they considered Muslim saint, the someone who is passed away is not dead. So it's highly recommended to visit the tombs of saints. And there's a great story of Imam Abdullah al-Haddad, who was an 18th century saint. He was a blind saint. He took one of his young followers with him. He said, just hold on to me. He went into the cemetery in Tarim, and he walked into the cemetery at midnight. And the young boy who was with him was terrified. And he said, Assalamu alaikum. And suddenly all the graves said, Assalamu alaikum. They answered him back, I mean, there are many stories like this. So yes, they're venerated and after they're dead. And but this is one of the things that's happened in the last century or so, is that this practice has been described as being sort of heretical and so on by people who by fundamentalists and the people who actually are the bedrock of extremism, in fact.
There was one question that came to my mind while we were talking. So wait, just one question that came to my mind was, given travels and you pointed to the answer a little bit in your earlier answer about the nature of distraction today, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to the sorts of what we might call today environmental factors which produce such exemplary people or moral exemplars in general. So what kind of forge produced such diamonds? Maybe it's a better way of putting it. And are there maybe commonalities throughout time that you've noticed or throughout the places you've visited?
Peter, do you have anything you could
I didn't quite understand the question. Are you saying it's to do with environment or something?
Well, I mean, what do you think produces an individual like this? I guess is what I'm trying to say, because there's nature versus nurture. People talk like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes people think, is it all just a person, or is it really there's a certain type of soil in which such people grow? You could say, right? And that's an interesting question, I think. And I just wonder if there's something, because you described, for instance, the environment in the Zawiya that was there, and that undoubtedly had an effect on the people that passed through that space.
Yeah.
So there seems to be something to do with, you could say, an environment that is created.
I think,
yeah,
I would say something about the purity of the saints and sages. They are drawn to certain places. Someone described it that there's certain places they have a thin atmosphere, which means that it's not polluted with a lot of, I don't know, airwaves or whatever, but it's a very pure place, a bit like Mecca or, Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock. That place itself is very spiritual, and therefore you access many other realms beyond it. So I think also some of these saints and sages choose places to live which are like that.
Mm.
And often many of them have been near pure sources of water and things, because water is so essentially important to a human being, and obviously pure water, the better. So I think it's a kind of unified thing. It isn't one aspect, but I think the purity of these people attracts those kind of environments. I mean, yeah, go on.
No, you carry on.
No, someone told me about somebody that was still alive that's 200 years old, and I said I wanted to visit them, and they said they're 4 days camel ride into the desert, and I said, oh, that's how they're able to live so long. There's no one bothers them, or they're not, in a city environment. So But I mean, there are saints that have lived in cities, and some of the people we featured in these books have lived in cities. But I think it's more to do with their upbringing. You know, they had very pure childhoods and they were with very good company, I think. So that's part and parcel of their journey.
Yeah, one of the things that we're exploring in the series is the necessity to keep good company, and that creates an environment. These people encourage you to sort of keep company with people who are like-minded and who are not, you know, sinners, let's say, people who are involved and engaged in all kinds of, you know, wrong behavior and so on. You have to sort of separate yourself from that and be in good company. It doesn't mean that you have to sort of drop out necessarily. But one of the saints that we included in the presentation, I unfortunately can't go back, was a man named Sidi Muhammad Bilkurshi, who he was like reclusive. He lived in a ksar, like this extraordinary desert fortress type of city. And sitting in his presence and in that place, I'm telling you, within half an hour, I was, excuse me for saying this, I was stoned. You know, I was completely intoxicated because it was so light, the atmosphere, and so pure. And you just start sort of floating on this, and it's uncanny. You're thinking like, is this really happening? Am I, where, what's happening? Because it's effortless. So those are extreme examples of that's maybe an extreme example of that, but that's a very environmental. But then also he had a rule that outsiders could only stay 24 hours in his place. And part of it was because if you stayed longer, the police would come around and bother them. But also, I think, you know, it was a discipline. You know, you don't just go there to hang out and be lazy.
Rumi uses this example that if you stay with a perfumer, you come away with all these exotic smells, and if you hang out with a blacksmith, your clothes can get burnt by the sparks. And it's a very simple analogy, but it kind of explains it very clearly. You know?
We had one question come in while you were talking about, just wondering about where you are with the project right now, what your rollout plans are, when you hope to release and debut things, how you plan to kind of shop it around, etc. And what you kind of have in store for the project going forward.
Right. Well, we're in the final stages of the project. We've all done books before, and prepared books, and a single book is challenging. 9 books is really challenging. So we're coming in. We're meant to go to press this next month, and then we're officially launching the project at the Bradford Literature Festival in England, and then we'll probably do some kind of a tour in the United States as well to expose the book. We're selling all the 9 books together as a box set. This is under advisement from distributors and booksellers in different places. And so we're in the final stages of putting the books together, having proofreading and all of that. This was supposed to take 1 year, but the project has taken almost 2.5 years because of the pandemic. It's slowed everything down, particularly with the authors. So that's where we are. I don't know if that's, and then also what we're planning to do is to try to encourage educators to use the book. I know that a couple of teachers who have, eminent teachers who've read some of the text have told us that they plan to use them as textbooks in their teaching. So what we're hoping to do is to encourage educators to get involved, and there are other books in the pipeline that we have, which we are not including in this original publishing venture, but which we'll probably roll out afterwards, and subsequently. So that's where we are. We have a website that's going live in the next couple of days, I think, and a kind of an Instagram feed to let people know where we are, and the website, we hope, will become a kind of repository of additional writing and information and videos, and we'll probably produce podcasts, or we will produce podcasts. That's part of our responsibility, and some video material on these people. So there's a lot of activity that's left to be done, but the main central project of the publication of the books is coming to a close. So we're working day and night to get everything ready for the printer, basically.
Awesome. Well, we really look forward to that. We might have
Yeah.
time for one more question, maybe two if someone else sends in another question while I'm talking. But we had a question that for Peter, which is whether there were any photographs that stand out in your mind as favorites of those that you've taken. Or is there an area of the world maybe that you've worked in that was particularly precious to you, impactful for you?
That's a very difficult question. It's like asking which is your favorite child, and it's very difficult for me to answer that. But it's for me, it was my own personal journey, which evolved into Meetings with Mountains, and now it's sort of expanded into this project. And I think for me, meeting these people is always very life-changing, and I'm always particularly aware of things that happen in those meetings, and I think they are things that you will take with you on your own personal journey. So I think for me, the actual having the meetings was very significant, and I'm really grateful for that. I think the challenge with this project was, many of these people I met at the end of their lives, and I didn't know them when they were younger, and as it was said, many of them had never been photographed before. So it was trying to source stuff that could find material that could tell their stories, I mean, there's one of the people, we ended up using his picture on the cover, and I realized that that picture came from an old passport of his with all this, the stamps, and I had to kind of spend hours cleaning it up to actually make it as the picture for the cover. So it's been quite a challenging project visually, but I think I'm excited about it. It's an interesting thing to have done. And of course, the text is amazing because it really tells their stories, which haven't been told before.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, if do you guys have any last remarks before we say goodbye?
I've talked enough. I have to say I've talked out. I don't have anything else. I'm happy to answer a question, but Peter is. I defer to Peter if he has anything.
Yeah, as I said, it was a challenge. Some of the pictures, really old pictures are torn and crumpled, and I had to just painstakingly restore these images. But it's just worth the effort, because when you see them, then it does bring their world to life, and I think that's fantastic, because to sort of see how they lived, and incredible lives they had and struggled, it's not a charismatic life. It's filled with a lot of difficulties, and I hope we've put that across in the series.
Well, I do want to thank you on behalf of the foundation and just personally for a very illuminating talk. That's part of the title there. If there's, we look forward to seeing how the project unfolds. And if anyone else here would like to get in touch with Michael or Peter, please let me know, and I'd be happy to put you in touch. But other than that, thank you again for attending, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.